Sometimes it is interesting to watch two people arguing. And it's interesting to see that they seem to argue about some specific things. But at a closer look, you realize that they're having a different way of thinking about the things that they're arguing about. And in fact, they're not arguing about the things that they think they're arguing about. They think in a different way. So it was pretty much the same between the Christian East and the Christian West. And this is why the Christianity split. The surface differences and what they seemed to argue about was the primacy of the Pope, the filioque, the leaven or unleavened bread, the purgatory, the celibacy of the clergy. These were the things that were arguing about. But at a closer look, we could see that on both sides, they developed different mindsets. What did happen to the Christian East in the Christian West that they developed different mindsets? As we could see last time, because of the migratory people and because of the appearance of Islam, communication between East and West was not very easy anymore. And this separated the Church of Rome from the other four big Christian centers in the East: Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. So Rome was by itself in the West. Also, in the 300s and the 400s, after the church received freedom, the church now could define its teaching very well. But by this time, the people in the West were not speaking Greek anymore. So there was a language barrier. And also we witnessed, after the fall of Rome under the migratory people, we witnessed the appearance of one main theologian in the West, Augustine of Hippo. And this main theologian of the Western Christianity gave the tone of the Western theology. Augustine of Hippo had an interesting life himself. His mother was Christian, but he was not. And he struggled in his life, as he says in his confessions, he struggled a lot with lust. He had a relationship with a woman, he had a child with her. He couldn't marry her because she was not of his social status. Nevertheless, he loved her, but then he decided to leave her and to become a real Christian. For the rest of his life, he struggled with lust and with bodily temptation. His conclusion was that the body is evil, and matter is evil, and the spirit is superior to the body. And also, because of his personal struggle, he has this idea of the sin and the sinfulness, and that the sin has to be punished. And he came up with the idea of original sin, and he even coined the term original sin. The early church didn't talk about original sin. It was Augustine in the late 300s, early 400s, who coined this term. So he gave the tone of the Western theology focused on sin and the punishment of sin and the retribution of sin. On the other hand, in the East, we had two big theological schools, one in Antioch, one in Alexandria, many times arguing with each other. Nevertheless, they had an argument and they stayed in touch. And we also, in the East, at the same time, in the 300s and the 400s, we had many theologians. We had St. Athanasius the Great, Basil the Great, Gregory of Nyssa, John Chrysostom, Gregory the Theologian, Cyril of Alexandria, like Cyril of Alexandria, was in a big argument with St. John Chrysostom. Nevertheless, they had someone to argue with and to bounce ideas by. Augustine was basically the only holy father in the West. Nobody to correct him and to tell him, you are not quite right about this. So, also in the East, all of these holy fathers affirmed the basic teaching of the Bible that God became human to make us divine. From the beginning to the end, the Bible reveals that this desire of God to dwell within humanity. And this became the main teaching of the Christian East. The dwelling of God in His grace within humanity and within creation. Not only within humanity, but also within His creation. And the deification of the human being through the indwelling of God's grace within humanity was the main teaching of the Christian East. At the same time, in the West, after the Dark Ages, we have some theological developments based in the theology of Augustine about sin and the original sin, and that someone has to pay the price for that original sin of humanity. Anselm of Canterbury, in the early second millennia, in the early second millennium, came up with a theory of atonement. The basic idea of the theory of atonement, according to Anselm of Canterbury, is that humanity sinned against God the Father. Humanity offended the divinity. And no human being could repair this sin of offending the divinity because we didn't listen to God. So another divine person, a divine person had to become incarnate. The Son of God had to become human to pay the price for the sin of humanity. So this whole idea of paying the price to God the Father by the Son, this was a completely strange teaching to the Christian East. But this became one of the main teachings of the Western Christianity. In the meantime, in the East, the theology of deification is consolidated in the threefold way of purification, illumination, and deification. So as you can see, on the one side in the West, the focus was on sin, and then paying the price for the sin, and then having even the Savior, the Son of God, come to pay the price for sin, and to pay the price to God the Father. In the Christian East, the emphasis was on the identification of God with us. God became human to make us divine. Of course, the Bible speaks in some places about paying the price. And some of the Orthodox Holy Fathers address those biblical passages, but they never became the focus of our theology. Those passages have always been understood in the Orthodox Church as paying the price to reality. Okay? Not to God the Father, not to the devil, but just paying the price to reality. But how was the price paid? It was not a debt that we had to pay to God the Father. The price was that the Son of God had to become human and to fully and completely experience our human condition even unto death. That was the price. It was like, let's say, a very good friend of ours gets into a terrible addiction and gets into prison, and then we go and we visit him in prison. And we spend time with him in prison. And we even request to be in prison with him just to spend time with him so that we could bring him back into life. And when he comes out of prison, he's healed. So that was the price. To pay the price to reality of becoming like us. also some other underlying differences developed in the East and in the West. In the West, we notice the appearance of scholasticism. The theology was more and more organized into categories, and everything had to have a definition, and it was a much more a theology of the mind. In the East, we had much more a theology of the heart. There was a big debate that we're going to talk about next time between the Christian East and the Christian West about what is the best way to get into a relationship with God and to know God. The West has always emphasized the mind. In the East, we always emphasized the heart. It is a spiritual relationship. Yes, the mind is involved, but the mind could get you only that far, and we should use the mind. But the mind cannot get you to know the one who is love and the one who is beyond anything we could know with the mind. It is a spiritual relationship. So on the one hand, scholasticism, on the other hand, mysticism. In the West, they started speaking about the grace of God being created. In the East, we maintain that the grace of God is uncreated. Getting to know God through the mind, as I said, or through the heart in the East. And in the West, they experience a continuous theological development. In the East, we experienced a theological stagnation imposed by Islam. Because wherever Islam took over a Christian territory, they allowed the Christians to exist and to pay higher taxes, but they didn't allow them to do any missionary work, which was a tragedy. Under the penalty of death, they couldn't do missionary work. They didn't allow any charitable work, which was a tragedy, or organized charitable work. And they didn't allow any theological schools, which was mostly a blessing. Because we're forced to keep the theology of the early church. And we couldn't have any theological developments. We just kept the theology of the early church. That's why I like to say that only by the grace of God we have the theology of the early church, and many times in spite of us and because of the Turks. But God works in mysterious ways, and because of this, we kept the theology of the early church. Thank you very much.